Orientalism, Romanticism, and the Dark Allure of Fascism by Harry Oldmeadow. The stereotypical image of the mystical East and its study as a realm beyond politics has been shattered by various developments in the last few decades. The political analyses and critiques of Orientalism by Edward Said and his successors in the field of post-colonial theory and subaltern studies, the political engagements of globally recognized spiritual leaders such as Mohandas Gandhi, Thich Nhat Hanh, and the present Dalai Lama, the dialectic between transformative socio-political ideologies, feminism, environmentalism, pacifism, and Western outgrowths of the Eastern religious traditions, the increasing involvement of religious institutions of both East and West in global political debates and movements combating imperialism, racism, patterns of exploitation, the abuse of human rights, war, terrorism, and ecological calamity. In this chapter, we will examine some nodal points at which Eastern religion and Western politics are inextricably intertwined, particularly in the collusion between Orientalism and Fascism. Zen and Japanese nationalism and militarism. The most concerted attempt to expose and unravel the obscure relations between Orientalism and Fascism came from a group of American scholars whose researches were gathered together in Curators of the Buddha, The Study of Buddhism Under Colonialism, 1995. In 6 closely argued essays, bristling with the somewhat baroque conceptual and rhetorical apparatus of post-colonial studies, the authors anatomized the growth of Buddhist studies within the contexts of the ideologies of empire. For the moment, we shall isolate their treatment of one particular strand in a very complex web, the nexus between Orientalism and Fascism. 3 figures who have loomed large in the present study came under the sternest scrutiny: D.T. Suzuki, Giuseppe Tucci, and Carl Jung. Earlier in this study, mention was made of Robert Scharf's critique of D.T. Suzuki's representation of Zen in, quote, the Zen of Japanese nationalism, end quote. In the context of our immediate concerns, it is worth returning to this provocative article. Robert Scharf opens with an account of the conceptually incoherent and historically naive Western construction of Zen as an iconoclastic and antinomian tradition which, purportedly, nurtures a spiritual awakening into the eternal present, marked by a liberation from the disabling constraints of cerebration, abstraction, and religious dogmatism, and an escape from history. Furthermore, such an unmediated experience, untainted by cultural accretions, comprises the ultimate source of all authentic religious teaching, and is thereby preeminently suited to serve as the foundation of interfaith dialogue. This image of Zen, Scharf argues, is only thinly connected with historical realities, and is to be at least partly explained by the activities of an elite of internationally minded Japanese intellectuals and globe-trotting priests, whose missionary zeal was often second to their vexed fascination with Western culture. After tracing changes within a Japanese Buddhist establishment increasingly influenced by Western infiltration in the Meiji period of modernization, Scharf turns his attention to Soyen Shaku's participation in the world's Parliament of Religions and to its aftermath, out of which D.T. Suzuki surfaced as the leading spokesman for Zen in the West. Much of Scharf's analysis is given to demonstrating that Suzuki and other apologists for the New Buddhism, such as Nishida Kitaro, Nishitani Keiji, and Nabe Hajime, present a Zen jaundiced by the polemics of Nihon Jinron, a narcissistic, racist, nativist, and supremacist theory positing a unique Japanese character and spiritual essence, in contradistinction to both other Asians and Westerners, and one closely connected with the growth of Japanese nationalism. Scharf argues that Suzuki and the Kyoto school popularized an idiosyncratic form of Zen which had little standing within the Japanese Zen establishment, which was full of obfuscations and confusions, as well as a nascent chauvinism and nationalist tendencies. He commends those few Western thinkers who put up some resistance to these self-appointed representatives of Zen in the West: Arthur Koestler, Gershom Scholem, Paul Demiville, and R.J. Zvi Zerblowski among them. In a postscript to the original article, Scharf discusses Suzuki's participation in the Order of the Star in the East, a theosophical subgroup associated with the messianic mission of Krishnamurti. Whilst conceding Suzuki's energy, sincerity, and commitment to Zen, Scharf again deplores his profligate apologetics and upbraids Western scholars for their uncritical acceptance of Suzuki's vision of Zen, their apparent suspension of their hermeneutical suspicion which attends most of their inquiries. Scharf's analysis underlines the connection between the New Buddhism, a revalorized samurai ethos, a chauvinistic Japanese nationalism, eventually issuing in an Oriental form of fascism, the Kyoto school, and Suzuki's construction of Zen. Brian Victoria, himself a Soto Zen priest and academic in New Zealand, turns more directly to the collusion of the Japanese Zen establishment in the jingoistic militarism of Japanese fascism. In Zen at War, 1997, he dispels any ingenious view that Zen Buddhism could not have been directly implicated in the brutalities of this regime. Victoria's researches into this dark chapter in Buddhist history unveils the processes by which Buddhism, a religion rooted in universal compassion, could have been transformed into a religion whose leaders, almost to a man, unconditionally pledged their support for Japanese militarism. Victoria charts the incorporation of institutional Buddhism into the Japanese war machine, starting with the Russo-Japanese War of 1905, and fully accomplished by about 1930, and the emergence of Imperial Way Buddhism, crossing all the Buddhist sects, which marked the total and unequivocal subjugation of the law of the Buddha to the law of the sovereign. Among the many functions of Imperial Way Buddhism was the religious justification of Japan's Holy War, waged with savage ferocity in China and Korea, and throughout Southeast Asia. In the course of his discussion, Victoria also establishes that figures such as Shoyen Shaku, D.T. Suzuki, Yamada Mumon, Harada Daiun, and Yasutani Hakuun were significantly implicated in these developments. Whatever else might be said of the indictment prosecuted by Scharf, Victoria, and others, there is no doubt that they have administered a powerful blow to the somewhat sentimentalized picture of Zen popularized by Alan Watts, Christmas Humphreys, and others in the West. They have also awakened us to the ever-present dangers of the ideological annexation of religious institutions and teachings. In this context, Christian readers may recall the dismay and outrage prompted by the exposure of the Vatican's complicity in the genocidal regime of the Nazis. Graham Parks, in a lengthy article in Philosophy East and West, issues a salutary caution about the whole debate about Zen and fascism. warning that we should not allow ourselves to lapse into a dismissive condemnation of Japanese Zen as a whole. Quote, "A recent trend within the North American Academy jeopardizes the study of the most accessible area of Japanese philosophy, 20th century thought, and the philosophy of the so-called Kyoto school in particular. I am referring to the current fashion, evident in the work of several figures in Japanese and Buddhist studies, of branding thinkers associated with the Kyoto school, such as Nishida Kitaro, Kuki Shuzo, and Nishitani Keiji, as mere fascist or imperialist ideologues, with the implication that their work is philosophically nugatory. The neo-Marxist revisionism that has been sweeping, or at least a corner of, the field of Japanology threatens to suppress open discussion of some important ideas, and thereby risks falling, with sad irony, into a fascism of the left." End quote. Orientalism, racial theory, and fascism. Let us assemble a few now well-known facts, each of which, in isolation, may seem of little significance, but which cumulatively suggest a problematic requiring the attention of anyone interested in our general subject. W.B. Yeats, Ezra Pound, and T.S. Eliot, and, to confuse the mix, Richard Wagner and Madame Blavatsky, were not only keen students of the Orient, but were all anti-Semitic, while Pound notoriously espoused the ideology of fascism. Mircea Eliade, Joseph Campbell, and Georges Dumézil, the doyen of Indo-European studies, were also anti-Semitic and were susceptible to the anti-modern appeal of extreme right political ideologies. More overt and virulent forms of, quote, spiritualized fascism can be found in the person and work of the Italian Orientalist Julius Evola. Martin Heidegger publicly and theatrically aligned himself with the Nazi regime in the early 30s and became an unabashed propagandist for Hitler's domestic and foreign policies. He was a Nazi informer and betrayed several Jewish friends and colleagues. Carl Jung evinced some enthusiasm for Nazism in its early years, discerning in it a hope of a spiritual regeneration of Europe. There are also more than a few traces of anti-Semitism in his writings. Unlike Heidegger, Jung was later implacably opposed to Nazism. As George Steiner has observed, the Alpine priesthood of Eranos was susceptible to a kind of conservative romantic mysticism, which was at least tinged with Führer politics. Heinrich Harrer was a member of the SS and maintained his links with other Nazis after the war. Karlfried Graf Dürkheim worked for Hitler's government in Japan in the late 30s. Eugen and Gusti Herigal were members of the Nazi Party. The Nazi administration, 1933 to 1945, had little difficulty in enlisting the services of several eminent Orientalists, including Walter Wüst, Ludwig Alstorff, and Erich Frauwallner, in the construction of its nationalist, racist, militaristic discourse. Heinrich Himmler, we are told, was an aficionado of the Bhagavad Gita. One of the foremost scholars of Germanic Indology writes, quote, "In German Indology of the NS, National Socialist, era, a largely non-scholarly mystical nativism deriving ultimately from a mixture of Romanticism and proto-nationalism merged with that objectivism of Wissenschaft, and together they fostered the ultimate Orientalist project, the legitimation of genocide." Despite his disclaimer in To Lhasa and Beyond, quote, "If there is anything I intensely dislike, it is just politics, anywhere and at any time," end quote, Giuseppe Tucci, Italy's most illustrious Orientalist, supported Mussolini, enjoyed his patronage, and became an apologist for the fascist regime. He nurtured a closer relationship between the fascist regime of his own country and Japan. Let us consider two of these figures, Evola and Eliada, in a little more detail. Julius Evola, painter, philosopher, quote, disciple, end quote, of René Guénon, colleague of Mircea Eliade, Orientalist and fascist ideologue, translated into Italian the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a poisonous anti-Semitic work whose authors included the racial ideologue of Nazism, Alfred Rosenberg. Evola claimed that this document, whether genuine or not, fitted the facts. In The Doctrine of Awakening, he elaborated an ideologically charged representation of Buddhism as Aryan, anti-democratic, aristocratic, esoteric, and elitist, a path fitted to the spiritual warrior. He referred to the, quote, unity of blood and spirit of the white races who created the greatest civilizations, end quote, and claims that the Aryans, quote, stood essentially for an aristocracy opposed both in mind and body to obscure, bastard, demoniacal races, end quote. It is worth quoting at some length from an essay Evola wrote in 1957, as it captures several themes pertinent to the discussion at hand. Quote, the Western friends of Buddhism have been almost unanimous in appraising it as a sentimental doctrine of love and universal compassion, a doctrine composed of democracy and tolerance, to be admired also for its freedom from dogma, rites, sacraments, almost a sort of secular religion. It is a falsification of the message of the Buddha, a deteriorated version suited not to virile men standing with head erect, but to men lying prostrate in search of escape and spiritual alleviation. Buddhism is above the plane of all that can be defined as religion. Zen Buddhism could be called the doctrine of the samurai, i.e., the Japanese nobility, who are certainly not noted for their abhorrence of arms and bloodshed. He who has a knowledge of these dimensions of Buddhism, what can he think of those who consider that Buddhism is not even a religion but a system of sickly, sentimental, secular morality consisting of humanitarianism and indiscriminate love, the pale, evanescent wisdom of one who has recognized that the world is suffering. As to the forms in which Buddhism has become a religion sui generis, and worse still, as to those forms in which it is conceived and appreciated as a democratizing humanitarian morality, they should rightly be considered as an unparalleled contamination of the truth. End quote. The Nietzschean echoes reverberating throughout this passage are audible enough. Given his influence on the emergence of the history of religions as a reputable academic discipline, Mircea Eliade's fascist involvements raise some particularly painful questions. Adriana Berger has assembled the evidence for the prosecution in a disturbing essay, Mircea Eliade, Romanian Fascism and the History of Religions in the United States. Eliade's early intellectual milieu was pervaded by a potent admixture of German Romanticism, Romanian nationalism, and Orthodox traditionalism, with a lowercase t, all stained with an anti-Semitism which became more rabid in the interwar period during which he came to maturity. Anti-Semitism was often intertwined with a rejection of communism, democracy, and materialism, all seen as symptoms of a decadent modernity, and with the affirmation of a Romanian identity, racial and political. The myth of Aryan superiority was imbricated with Romania's mythological past, Dacism or Dacism, I'm not sure, the cult of Zalmoxis, the assimilation of a pagan warrior ethos, and Orthodox Christianity, and consolidated by the spectre of a Jewish threat to racial, quote, purity. All these elements were on full display in the fascist organization, the Iron Guard, also known as the Legion of the Archangel Michael, headed by the notorious Captain Codreanu, who declared, quote, "The greatest wrong done to us by Jews is neither the grabbing of Romanian soil, nor the great number of Jews in our schools, professions, etc., and not even the influence they exercise over our political life, though each of these is a mortal danger for our people. The greatest national peril is the fact that they have deformed, disfigured our Daco-Romanic racial structure. From among all pests brought to us by the Jewish invasion, this is the most frightening one." End quote. The Iron Guard was a nationalist and mystico-religious movement of a messianic character violently opposed to democracy and communism, which were associated with the Jews. Codreanu repeatedly warned of the international threat of the Jews and asserted that a, quote, total solution of this problem could not be reached except through action by all the Christian nations, end quote. He applauded Hitler's war against the, quote, Judeo-Masonic Hydra, end quote, and declared that, quote, "We shall crush the Jews under our heels, or else we shall gloriously die," end quote. During the 1930s, Eliada supported anti-Semitic laws and echoed some of Codreanu's themes in his own writings, including the need for, quote, racial detoxification, end quote, though his references to the Jews were somewhat more oblique. He wrote of the, quote, noble religious ideals, end quote, and the, quote, virile vitality, end quote, of the Iron Guard, and applauded its program of national purification and spiritual regeneration. During the war, Eliada served the pro-Nazi Romanian government as press and propaganda attaché in Lisbon. After his forced move to Paris in 1945, Eliada maintained contacts with the followers of the military dictator Antonescu. Whilst he retreated from some of the more extreme racial and nationalist themes to be found in his writings of the 1930s, which have only recently come to light, his work continued to bear the stamp of that peculiar blend of mystico-religious and nationalist elements. There is no evidence that he showed any signs of regret for his earlier fascist enthusiasms, and we may share George Steiner's disquiet over the, quote, central silence, end quote, about the Holocaust in the voluminous writings of an historian of religions so deeply concerned with the cultural crisis of his times. In the writings of many of the figures mentioned above, we can find a romantic exaltation of an ascesis and an aesthetic of violence presented in terms of creative force, the samurai ethic, spiritual virility, the will to power, the spirit of Bushido, and the like. They were also heirs to a continental romanticism central to which, in Theodor Adorno's memorable phrase, was, quote, the agitator's dream, a union of the horrible and the wonderful, a delirium of annihilation masked as salvation, end quote. What are we to make of this disturbing web of connections between Orientalism and ideologies which led to the extermination chambers of Auschwitz? Perhaps Arthur Koestler's preposterous and generally ignorant attack on Zen carried a germ of truth when he claimed that, quote, by virtue of its anti-rationality and amorality, Zen always had a fascination for a category of people in whom brutishness combines with pseudo-mysticism, from samurai to kamikaze to beatnik, end quote. It might be argued that any sizable group, such as Orientalists, is likely to attract individuals from across the political spectrum, and that we should not be surprised that some of these will inevitably be susceptible to the appeal of extremist ideologies. This demonstrates nothing more than the trite fact that Orientalists are all too human. Certainly, we should not expect Orientalists to be somehow immune to the political and cultural fashions of the day. It might not be difficult to show that many Western scholars today engaged in the study of Eastern religions are disproportionately liberal leftist, admittedly a horribly vague but not entirely empty label, in their political leanings, or that their inquiries are colored by both theoretical and ideological sympathies which are currently fashionable in various quarters. But such a reading would be to dispose of the problem rather too easily. We must at least pose the question of whether there is some deeper connection between fascism, or more generally, movements of the extreme right, and Orientalism. The immediate background to this issue is the growth of racial theory and the intensification of 19th century racist attitudes, of which anti-Semitism was the most pervasive in the European intelligentsia, in a climate which was largely the creation of continental Romanticism. Romanticism itself must be seen as highly problematic and ambiguous cultural movement. As Robert Sayer and Michael Levy have written, quote, "But what exactly is Romanticism? An indecipherable enigma, because it is a coincidentia oppositorum, at the same time, or alternately, revolutionary and counter-revolutionary, cosmopolitan and nationalist, realist and fanciful, restorationist and utopian, democratic and aristocratic, republican and monarchist, red and white, mystical and sensual." End quote. Romanticism was not only one avenue through which European intellectuals were exposed to Eastern ideas and values, but was also the vehicle for a plethora of theoretical formulations about race, nation, and identity. Several streams of thought merged in Romanticism and left their mark on an emergent Orientalism. An animus to Judaic theology, easily identified in the writings of Herder, Schlegel, Hegel, and Schopenhauer, which was sometimes an accomplice to anti-Semitism, either mild or virulent, the idealization of an Aryan race which, supposedly, bequeathed civilization the Indo-European family of languages, the nascent blood and soil ideology of the Germanic folk, and the search for national self-determination, cultural identity, and national mission, often associated with an anti-liberal, anti-egalitarian, anti-democratic revolt against modernity, the reinforcement of popular, stereotypical racist images of non-Aryan Indians and the Chinese, the elaboration of quasi-biological and evolutionistic racial theories, such as those of the French diplomat and Orientalist J. Arthur de Gobineau, 1816 to 1852, and Richard Wagner's son-in-law, the Englishman Houston Stewart Chamberlain, 1855 to 1926. Gobineau constructed one of the most sinister of the 19th century racial theories. In Essai sur l'inégalité des races humaines, 1853 to 1855, he posited an inherent inequality of races, a racial purity which could only be preserved by the prevention of miscegenation and the racial superiority of whites, amongst whom the Aryans were, quote, the most noble, the most intelligent, and the most dynamic, end quote. The National Socialists drew on the ideas of both Gobineau and Chamberlain in constructing the idea of the German Aryan master race. Considering this chaotic intellectual and ideological terrain, J.J. Clark, one of the most thoughtful commentators on the phenomena in question, has this to say, quote, "It is evident that in the late 19th century and early 20th century, Orientalism sometimes became ensnared by and gave succor to the emerging racist discourse. However, the extraordinary web of ideological convergences which characterized European thought at that time, involving inter alia, race, eugenics, nationalism, naturalism, evolutionism, and occultism, and responding to the kindling fever that had taken hold of Europe, became entangled together in what must seem, in retrospect, to be a series of unlikely and contingent associations. It would be a mistake, then, to ascribe some essentially racist taint to Orientalism. Apart from the awkward interwovenness of so many disparate intellectual and cultural strands, we need to keep in mind as well the fact that the intercalation of the languages, histories, and religions of India and Europe, sketched out by a series of Orientalists from Jones and Schlegel to Quinet and Max Müller, represented a powerful force for the expansion and enrichment of traditional Western outlooks, laying foundations for an enhancement of intercultural understanding and helping to moderate endemic xenophobic attitudes. Nonetheless, it should not be forgotten that Gobineau and others turned to the East to conceptualize redemptive options, with which to combat what they perceived as the degenerate pathologies of a decadent Europe. Analogous considerations, Clark suggests, apply in the association of Orientalism and Fascism. Certainly, the early century European sense of both existential and cultural crisis, widespread amongst intellectuals and artists, impelled an adversarial posture towards a mediocre and moribund bourgeois civilization and stimulated the search for spiritual and intellectual sustenance in sources outside the mainstream. Quote, Orientalism and Fascism were two amongst the many exemplifications of this transformative angst. End quote. Another was the nostalgia for the Ancien Régime and a repudiation of democratic egalitarianism. Something of the mood of the 30s is caught in Heidegger's Introduction to Metaphysics, 1935. Quote, "For the darkening of the world, the flight of the gods, the destruction of the earth, the transformation of man into a mass, the hatred and suspicion of everything free and creative, have assumed such proportions throughout the earth that such childish categories as pessimism and optimism have long since become absurd." End quote. For many of the figures mentioned above, the East came to symbolize a realm uncontaminated by the corruptions of Europe, while fascism seemed to hold out the promise of a spiritual regeneration. Both Orientalism and fascism also tapped into subterranean currents of irrationalism which originated in the Romantic rebellion against the Enlightenment and which sometimes manifested themselves in bizarre cults and extremist politics directed towards a cultural renovatio. The point of our considerations must be to recognize the dangers of any scholarship, or religious commitment for that matter, which opportunistically allows itself to be turned to inhumane political ends and which thereby compromises its allegiance to the truth. By the same token, we must not balk at the unpalatable fact that many distinguished scholars, intellectuals, and religious leaders allowed themselves to be used for malignant political purposes, both in the East and the West. Far from allowing us to indulge in vacuous moralizing and rhetorical point scoring, a sharpened awareness of these past complicities should make us all the more sensitive to the ever-present ways in which both intellectual and moral integrity can be compromised and scholarship bent to the service of sinister purposes. But let us not surrender to the facile judgments evident in the peremptory dismissal of some of these figures, solely on ideological grounds. The fact that Heidegger was susceptible to the evil conjurations of Nazism certainly raises some deeply troubling questions about his whole intellectual project. This hardly justifies catapulting all of his works into the nearest dustbin without further ado. Acknowledging and deploring the anti-Semitism of an Eliada or a T.S. Eliot does not entail a wholesale rejection of their work any more than a recognition of the same prejudice in Shakespeare means we must burn our copies of his plays. At the same time, a recognition of currents of venomous anti-Semitism, authoritarianism, and xenophobic nationalism in Romantic Orientalism, often camouflaged by a pseudo-mystical vocabulary, must qualify our enthusiasm for the very real and imposing achievements of figures such as Eliade, Heidegger, and Tucci. Their indisputable intellectual feats cannot exculpate them from some degree of complicity in the barbarisms of European fascism, one which must be faced squarely in any assessment of their work and their significance as cultural heroes. If you value my work, I'd be most grateful if you would like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with anyone you think might be interested. If you would like to support me in working on this project, I'd be deeply thankful if you would consider becoming a regular supporter through Patreon or making a one-time donation through Ko-fi, links in the description. If you do subscribe, please remember to hit that little bell icon because otherwise YouTube won't inform you when I upload new videos. If you'd prefer to read my essays over the video format, they are all available in written form on Substack, link also in the description.